Welcome to Flipping the Table. In this episode, Michael is joined by Dr. Stephen Chen to explore the concept of food and medicine and how Dr. Chen applies food as medicine to his work as a family physician serving low-income families in Alameda County, which is where I live. Enjoy the show.
Hello, this is Michael. Food is medicine is a common phrase I'm hearing these days through involvement with coalitions seeking to build nutrition security, which is different from food security. Nutrition security ensures people have access to food that improves health. Food security, the old paradigm, was about delivering any kind of food to those in need. The core difference is that nutrition security recognizes that not all calories are the same. What I will call the food as medicine movement recognizes that the right foods can heal illness, particularly diet-related disease like type 2 diabetes. Type 2 is costing the United States around $147 billion a year in healthcare costs, lost productivity and wages, not to mention the untold suffering from amputations, blindness, and chronic pain that this disease brings. Today, I want to share my conversation with Dr. Stephen Chen, who is at the forefront of an exciting, sophisticated, and impactful use of food to heal patients in clinical settings. Dr. Chen is the Chief Medical Officer at All In Alameda County, which is a community clinic system serving low-income families. He is the son of immigrants from Taiwan. Thus, he understands the critical importance of language access. He is a graduate of the Stanford School of Medicine and is a board-certified family physician with training in both acupuncture and osteopathic manipulative medicine. Dr. Chen brings an integrative health equity lens to his work, leading the scale-up of Recipe for Health, a food as medicine initiative across Alameda County health clinics and health systems. As you will see, he has a systems perspective on how to improve health and sees very clearly the close tie between individual health, how we farm, and what we eat. He is a model of the doctors that we need in this century to fix food and improve the health of all of our people. I know you will enjoy our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Stephen Chen. Really glad to have you here today to talk about food as medicine. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thank you so much, Michael Demock. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to share with your guests.
Yeah, a pleasure. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to ask you my first question, which is to kind of set context, I guess. In comparison to exercise, smoking, career, stress, how important to human health is nutrition?
Nutrition is fundamental, and it's the whole package, really, meaning all of these elements are important. And so it's not really a one is the best. But I will say that nutrition, sleep, exercise are key elements of one's health. And if you only do one dimension, you're going to miss out. Many people forget, though, the food piece because there's such a cultural, familial momentum from early childhood. And so it's one of these invisible things that we just assume happens as long as we're not hungry. And we fuel our body 3 times a day, 4 times a day, however many snacks you have. And that has fundamental, immediate pathways of inflammation, anti-inflammation, that when extended over a lifetime, lead us down certain pathways of health or disease.
Mm-hmm. Let's jump into the fact that it seems that American medicine is focused primarily on treatment of disease. So what you're doing is different. Why are you focused on food as medicine and produce prescriptions? And what's the difference between the concept of food as medicine and produce prescriptions?
Food as medicine is a larger construct in which we in healthcare reclaim the power of food. It's often overlooked. Historically, and if we look from indigenous, from our cultural origins, food has been always a critical piece of our maintenance and optimization of health. And we battled acute conditions, viruses, pneumonia, all of that. And modern medicine, post-Flexner medicine, really focused on addressing those acute issues. Mm-hmm. Sometimes to the detriment of the fundamentals, some of the fundamentals you just mentioned around food, sleep, nutrition, exercise, all of those. Mm-hmm. So food as medicine is healthcare, remembering that food is critical. And I say healthcare, particularly with a particular context of biomedicine, because other traditions have often and continue to recognize food as a powerful medicine. So I'm speaking as a biomedicine trained physician. And from that stance, it's reclaiming the impact and the power of food as medicine. I tie it to the former comment that it's more than just food, right? Food as a medicine is an important vehicle, but it's complemented by all the other elements. Where produce prescriptions come in is a particular intervention along the spectrum of food-based interventions in healthcare. Mm-hmm. And it's a very powerful one because of many things we can talk about. Mm-hmm. But at the high level, it's medicine reclaiming the power of food, especially often neglected, and using it not only to kind of maintain health, but to treat in chronic conditions, mm-hmm. to prevent them, certainly, and then to reverse along the causal chain from health to quaternary care, to downstream end-stage disease. You can still use food as part of that treatment pathway.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that other cultures, I think particularly of Asian cultures, where food is part of the medical practice already. I mean, there are foods. I remember once I went to San Francisco because I got a hernia and I had acupuncture, and then I was given a bag full of a bunch of different things that I boiled down for a month, like every day, and it healed. I didn't have to have surgery. My doctor thought I was going to have surgery, and I healed this wound. So
let me take that point as an example of the power of just the components of food. Your first question, why food compared to, say, nutrition or to exercise and whatnot? And I spoke to it around dosage, right? If we use the kind of pharmaceutical lens around dosage of medicine, a pill 1 time a day, 3 times a day, once a week, food is a powerful input into the body, telling our DNA to go to express genes and proteins in a particular way, turning things off and on, switches off and on. That is happening every time you consume something. Mm-hmm. So you're taking that for a month and going down a particular pathway was you're giving your body switches that said, hey, let's go down this pathway towards healing. Instead of, if you were, say, eating tons of added sugar, mm-hmm. That's going to be a very different pathway. Your recovery is going to be very different. Even if you got the antibiotic on top or the acupuncture on top. Mm-hmm. So it's a fundamental building block.
Mm-hmm. That's good. You got into the difference between food as medicine and produce prescriptions, but I want to go a little deeper now. Let's talk about, and I think the way to do that maybe is for you to talk about Recipe for Health, which is the program that you run for the system that you are, chief medical officer for. So why don't you talk about that program, Recipe for Health, and the 3 different elements of it, and then we can get into more depth around produce prescriptions as a specific tool.
So Recipe for Health, R for H in short, is happening here in Alameda County, California. It is an integrative model of healthcare that is addressing 3 elements, 3 targets, if you will, at the same time. Number 1, food insecurity as a social determinant of health. Number 2, chronic conditions, the bread and butter of what health centers and health clinics do here and all over the country. And number 3, health and racial equity. Why are we doing all 3, and why are we doing it all together? And why is food as medicine a critical piece of that? The food insecurity piece is just one of many social determinants of health. This fancy concept, upstream issues that actually that impact our patients downstream and send patients to us daily, but was 10 to 15 years in the making, right? The food insecurity that led to a 200% increase in diabetes in that patient. That didn't happen overnight, right? We in healthcare, in medical care, have been downstream for too long. And we have not addressed, we've wanted to, and we said we have to address these things, but we haven't. We said, oh, that's for policy people, that is for social services, that's for everyone else to deal with, education, everyone else. And this is our attempt to say, actually, we can help close the bridge too, or bring the bridge to close the gap too, as healthcare people. And so this is one way that healthcare can address social determinants of health in a very singular pathway that's actually fairly close to what we do. Because again, if we reclaim our role of food as medicine, then we can do that. So that's the larger architecture of why we're blending all, and the chronic conditions is what we're supposed to do day in, day out, but we're failing as a country, right? $3.9 trillion on healthcare and 3.4 of them on managing chronic care, 90% of our budget. So we're not doing the best job, right? And then certainly health and racial equity. So this is the larger architecture. Why Recipe for Health? Recipe for Health, you'll notice the word recipe. Any recipe has ingredients. Our recipe has 3 ingredients. And those 3 ingredients are actually, we think, a nice recipe that can be taken outside of Alameda County to any other county, state-wise as well as nationally. So let me go through the 3 ingredients. Yeah. The first ingredient being what we're calling a food pharmacy. And our food pharmacy is spelled Pharmacy because our pharmacy is connected to locally grown, regeneratively grown food. Now, a food pharmacy in Minnesota or in New York may not have to be a farm base, but could be potentially, or it may be another source of food. So in a sense, this ingredient can be adapted to your locale. And I'll talk more about that ingredient, but I'll just lay out the ingredients. The second ingredient is what we're calling our behavioral pharmacy. Now, this is a pharmacy with the PH part, but why behavior? Because it's one thing to have healthcare embrace food and to say, hey, we're actually going to make it available now to patients. It's another to do the coaching and the rewiring of behavior and habits to optimize the food and to build it into all of the other elements, the exercise. It's cognitive and habitual pathways, right? It's one thing for me to know that I should do this, but then the other one, I actually prepare my food or not. So the behavioral pharmacy allows us to amplify that effect. And we do it in partnership with health coaches. And I'll talk more about that specifically at Alameda County, but I'm laying out the possibility for others. And then the third piece is what we're calling the training piece, my team's piece. We do the training of the clinical teams in these health centers on how to use food as medicine in a 15-minute visit. We do all of the workflows in the electronic health record, the training on screening for food insecurity, the training of the clinicians on how to do this. Remember, and I say this now, having been out of practice, graduated from med school back in 2000 and, been practicing enough years now to say that we in medicine, me in biomedicine, physicians have not had a lot of training on how to use food as medicine in a 15-minute visit. The data shows 4 to 7 hours in 7 years of education.
Wow.
Right. And that's really just biochemistry and whatnot. It's not how I would do this with Michael today if you walked in. Mm-hmm. I remember, and I'm going to go a little just storytelling, when I was at Stanford in basic science training in medical school, I believe it was Dr. Paul Berg. He was a Nobel laureate, one of the early founders of that whole field of molecular biology and all of this stuff around PCR, all of this stuff that we are using now. And he said in lecture, 30 years from now, the whole field of nutrition is going to be where we were 20 years ago developing molecular biology. Like, it's going to get to that level, and it's become that. Mm-hmm. So those are the 3 larger elements. Mm-hmm. If it's okay, I'm going to expand a little in terms of the piece in Alameda County.
Yeah.
The food pharmacy, our food pharmacy, we use the word pharmacy for both food and behavior because it's a delivery system. Just like I would write you a prescription for antibiotics or some blood pressure medicine, where would you get that? If I give you that prescription, you can take it to a pharmacy.
Right.
Walgreens, whichever pharmacy. If that didn't exist, how would you actually fulfill my prescription for health? Pretty difficult, right?
Do it.
And yet, isn't that what we tell our patients every day when they come and see me? Hey, eat better, get some support. I'll see you in 4 months, 6 months. Okay, doc, now what? Right? If you have the resources, you go to the gym, you get the food you want, all of that. But what do we do for our most vulnerable patients that are strapped with all of these issues? So our food pharmacy is a delivery system. And it's quite literally a delivery to your house. I write a prescription for food, for what we call medically supported food, for your diabetes, your high blood pressure. Even if you have food insecurity, add that on top. Our farm grows this food regeneratively and then processes the food. Processes meaning just bags it, prepares it, cleans it. We have refrigerated vans at the county. We've made that investment through our partnership with the Deputy Sheriff's Activities League and Dig Deep Farms. Dig Deep Farms is the farm we're currently using. They're the critical farm throughout the county, and they deliver it to your doorstep weekly.
Wow.
For the dosage of right now, we're in 3 months, 4 months, we're working on those elements. That's the food pharmacy piece. There's a whole regenerative piece around that for why we're doing this. Soil health, human health, planetary health, all the connections. Mm-hmm. And then we move into the behavioral pharmacy. We're partnering with Open Source Wellness, and they're ready to scale nationally. They are a community-based health coaching team, and they partner with our clinicians, and they do together. We do the behavioral coaching and nutrition education for our patients that get the food. So there's a movement coach. Everyone's doing movement. You're asking about exercise. Mm-hmm. There is nutrition coaching and through food demos. And what do you do with this kale? What do you do with these collards?
So they're like cooking. I mean, they actually teach people how to cook it.
There's some cooking elements to it. There's also a mindfulness piece, stress reduction, recognizing that's it, the mind-body piece. And then finally, the social connection, the power of bringing all the patients together that have multiple different conditions, high blood pressure, depression, whatnot. It's not a singular group like diabetes, all together, and getting coaching and the breaking of social isolation, especially during COVID. Those four elements coming together, amplifying the food is the full package. And then you have our team training the clinicians with a chef MD or other people, chef physicians, myself, training the clinicians. How do you do this? Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was a long description, but I want to dig down to detail.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful. That's what we needed to hear, because I think people need to understand how all the pieces fit together. And you got to the produce prescription piece very beautifully there. And the fact that you're connected to a farm that's using regenerative practices. How did you come to the decision to use the regenerative practices, a farm? I mean, that's more expensive food normally.
Well, it's expensive. It depends. Where we cut the cost. And I think the same thing in healthcare, right? The expense is all these wildfires. The expense is drought. That's much more costly than an investment early, right? So a produce prescription argument would be you provide $400, $500, $600 of food for a family of four in a month, compared to one admission for someone who's diabetic who gets low blood sugar. That's about $15,000. So which one is more expensive, right? And at what cost? Right. So there's that. But how we got to regenerative, I mean, part of it is I bring my own family history here. My grandfather was a farmer from Taiwan. I'm Taiwanese American. He was a third grade illiterate, taught himself how to read farmer, right? And my dad, his son, learned along the way. He came here as a grad student to become an engineer, but he's still a green thumb. It skipped me. Somehow it didn't penetrate down to me. I kind of went the whole higher ed thing and got lost my hands and didn't get into the soil and everything. Right. So there's a personal connection. Mm-hmm. There's also just, coincidental things. We had an opportunity to partner with Dig Deep Farms. They came to us and we connected and said, hey, well, how do we do this? And so the fact that they're regenerative to me was powerful, because as I learned more and more about the source and elements of food, it was like, hey, higher nutrient density, no pesticides. We're talking regenerative without pesticides. I know there's regenerative practices that use tons of pesticides.
Oh, but no perfect.
Pesticides. Right. So, if I'm going to prescribe this food to my pregnant patients or to my pediatric patients as a family doc, I'm a family doc by training. I don't want to send them anything around that. And then how do we use regenerative politically, if you will? And maybe that's not the right word, regenerative right now. There's all these different terms. But to say all of our patients, the most vulnerable, can have this type of food. This should be the standard. The standard from indigeneity back in the days when food was not processed in the way we do it. Where now food is, if you are rich or you have resources, you can go to Whole Foods. Right. Well, let's make the Whole Foods available to all at free or low cost, and it's just part of our food system. And healthcare, its $3.9 trillion industry, is going to wake up and create the demand for that.
Yeah, three things came to my thoughts about this. One is that I listened to a speech that Tom Vilsack, USDA secretary, gave a few weeks ago, where he announced that the USDA is no longer going to use the idea of food security. They're talking about nutrition security, which is really what you're talking about. You're talking about nutrition security, not food security, because it's thinking it recognizes the difference between calories, what types of calories you're putting in your body, and as you said, all the impacts that occur because of that, the pathways that open, the openings and the closings of different things that happen in your body. So that was very interesting that's happening, that you're part of this wave, kind of the front end of this wave that's impacting. I mean, if it gets to the USDA, that means it's becoming acceptable at a very large scale. So that's important. The second thing is that he said that the United States is, due to type 2 diabetes, is costing us $147 billion a year in treatment and lost productivity and wages, in addition to all the suffering that we know that occurs because of it. It's incredible, the cost of that one disease. And as you described, spend 600 to feed people, or you spend 15,000 to treat them when they come in, which they will do many times if they're diabetic and they're low income. So the third thing that's really important to me is this understanding that you as a doctor, as a physician, have, that what happens in the soil on the farm impacts the people that you care for. That is, I don't think that is the cutting edge, really, to me, that linkage, because the food system is a fundamental system. It's the base of civilization. If that's messed up, the waves flow so many places. So I'm excited by what you're doing. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about the training that you're doing with other systems to understand how we can get the federal government to cover the costs associated with what you're doing, CalAIM and all those pieces.
Sure, absolutely. So there's a number of levers to take. In California, we have this opportunity called CalAIM, California Advancing Innovations in Medi-Cal. This is really a federal to state kind of sign off to say, you state can do some innovations around your Medi-Cal system, which then usually leads to Medicare and other reforms, right? To help us address fundamental issues, such as social determinants of health, such as chronic conditions, such as health equity and racial equity. And the state has now, through CalAIM, given a pathway. And I should say the state, I should say this has been a collaborative effort. It's a team, a whole steering committee of folks doing medically supportive food, for which I'm on, and there's a bunch of other leaders across the state working on crafting and architecting what is the pathway for food as a pathway for medical systems to offer, right? And so the state, we've helped to craft that language with the state, and it's given the green light currently optionally for health plans to pay for, if you will, some of these innovations. They can opt in. So it's not quite what we call a covered benefit, which would be, it's just automatic now for everyone. It's an opt-in for these next 5 years. My hope, and I think all of our hopes, is after this 5-year demonstration, this becomes a covered benefit, right? It's just part of the standard in California. What that does is health plans now can offer what we're calling medically supportive food, this larger name, as well as side by side with medically tailored meals, which I'm sure you're aware of. But it's really a lot of options, a lot of food interventions under this, what we're terming medically supportive food and nutrition.
So produce prescriptions is within
part of that.
Yeah.
Produce prescriptions, food pharmacies, medically tailored meals, medically supportive foods, a list of options, because we recognize, Michael, you may be seeing me an outpatient and need a particular type of intervention at this time for your, say, diabetes. But when you're hospitalized, you may need a different type of intervention along the food spectrum. And so giving the flexibility to clinicians on the ground to work with their patients who they know best over time makes sense. So that is a fundamental pathway.
Yeah, that's good. And that reminds me of a couple other things I wanted to mention. One is that hospital systems, I know that UC Davis Med Center has brought in a very skilled chef.
That's right.
Who is now buying from local farms like you're doing and regenerative farming systems to change the menus in the hospital so that people are eating very well when they're in a hospital. Sadly, my nephew was in a very bad accident and ended up being helicoptered to UC Davis Med, and he said the food was tremendous. He didn't expect that. You hear food is bad in hospital. Well, I'm in Maine right now, And one of the reasons I came here is because the Maine Medical's doing a very similar thing, and they're going to source. It's going to take them a while to build it because they got to source from a larger pattern, a larger footprint, because they don't have the weather. But they're going to go down the East Coast and get food from the region in the same way. So it's catching on. It seems it's catching on.
We hope you're enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
The thing that I'm really interested in hearing now is maybe you could tell, I loved it when you talked about your own personal experience. Are there stories you can tell about the improvements, the healing that you've seen as a result of the interventions that you're making with food as medicine?
Sure. I mean, there's always anecdotes that we as clinicians see on the ground, right? And they're real, they're valuable. And then there's kind of varying levels of evidence around what constitutes the evidence we need to shift the policy or to make the resource investments. But you're asking really at the anecdotal level, like, what am I seeing? So I'll give you some examples. I mean, I as a clinician in this space in our Recipe for Health program, I have a patient who I help manage and take care of in our behavioral pharmacy, getting the food pharmacy inputs. 50-ish, 60-ish older woman, Mexican-American woman, who had long-term diabetes and was on insulin for 15 years. 15 years coming to me, right? Wow. And with high doses, we're talking 70 units. That's a high dose of insulin every day. Having low sugar events, but no one picked it up. Really just, no one ever talked to her about the food elements and all the nutrition and the physical activity and all of that. In working with her and the team in our program, we were able to reduce her insulin from 76 down to 0 to 5.
Wow.
0 to 5 units.
Wow.
I would be managing her reduction of her medications, her reduction of her insulin, her shifting of her oral medicines to other medicines. And this happened over time. This happened over probably 5 months, 6 months.
Wow.
Right. So normally we in medicine are trained, once you're on insulin, you're just on it for and it just goes up and up and up. So we took this patient, we were able to get her off of it. Her sugars got better control. Her indicator, we have what's called an A1C.
Right.
And it actually improved. She had less low sugar events. Those $15,000 events that could have happened. She just started not having low sugar events. And she understood what food she needed to eat and at what time and how often. The when, the what, and how to eat food is what we train on when I'm teaching the clinicians and the teams on the ground. So that's just one example. I have other patients where we're able to easily, meaning it's doable, reverse their prediabetes to get them out of pre-diabetic ranges, right? And prediabetes is one of those precursors. For you, if you were Michael, I saw you in prediabetes. Normally we get medicine, don't worry about it. You're okay. Just do this and I'll see you in a year. And then over time, your rate of diabetes increases. And then 15 years later, you got your diabetes. 10 years later, you have your diabetes and all the downstream consequences. When I see a pre-diabetic, I have these options, Recipe for Health type interventions. I know I have a pathway forward to help that patient get off that train that's going to go off the cliff. We're going to shape that trajectory and we can do it together. The question will be, can they maintain that trajectory, right? But the fact that we can demonstrate that addresses some of the nihilism that we in medicine have. When people come to us, we're so used to people coming to us downstream. There's no chance of changing, just maintain and then hopefully add more meds, right?
Yeah, it shows how you're going to save money, right? You get people when they're pre-diabetic, you prevent the disease and they're in a lot better shape. Physically, they have a better quality of life, but also the entire system, which is already stressed, doesn't have to face more stress because of additional patients and more need for interventions. So you started to talk about the clinical data that's also important. So are you part of studies right now? Are you guys delivering data to studies? Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure, certainly. When we started this initiative, it was important in my mind to start with research and evaluation as well, to begin the research and evaluation infrastructure. Because having been in healthcare as a clinician as well as an administrator and kind of moving into policy work, it's great to build fancy, great programs. It's another to be able to actually start early and think about what's the measurement of this success. You don't measure it, can't manage it. You don't measure it, you can't demonstrate and tell the narrative. So we invested early in developing partnerships. And so we have a partnership with Stanford School of Medicine, with UCSF, to help evaluate and research our program and to use an implementation science perspective, meaning we aren't just going to look at the data and then 5 years later say, this is what we found. We are actually looking at the data every other week now. We built the infrastructure to say, well, what's happening here in our various communities and the various pathways? Oh, well, what do we need to do to get the data, number one, to curate the data, number two, to analyze the data, and then to feed that back into the programmatic elements? How do we need to shift the program based on whatever data we're beginning to have? Now, mind you, building these things for people who are just trying to build programs is not an easy task, because we're just so busy trying to build programs. But then to actually have to be able to build in the evaluation and research piece is important. My hope is that we in California, the state, as it goes through this whole CalNAME opportunity, that we start to look at what is the larger data and research that we should be starting now and before for these 5 years. We don't want to pass 5 years. And so what do? We have a few anecdotes, powerful as they may be.
We know from the data that white supremacy and structural racism have led to huge inequities, health inequities, and differences in outcomes and longevity for people of color. So, can you talk about how you see food as medicine and produce prescriptions contributing to creating much more health equity? I mean, you gave an example of a Latinx woman who you treated, and that's one specific story. But is there a bigger frame or a larger way that you think about this challenge and this need?
Those structures permeate everything. And so every sector has an opportunity to stand up and figure out how to address and struggle with those issues. And if we don't, as folks in medicine, then we're complicit, right? And then the question is, well, how do we do it? And that's your question. I think, one, addressing social determinants of health like food insecurity is one pathway that healthcare can stand up and to take its rightful place. So it's not just kind of giving that over to everyone else. And we know that food insecurity has a racial inequity component, right? We know that Black and Latinx folks who are 2 times higher rate of food insecurity. And during the pandemic, that African-American communities went up to 36% of households versus, say, the 23% that may have happened that was already an augmentation overall. So we know that we have to do a better job in healthcare to address food insecurity. And then how do we do that? One is the food as medicine approach. We tie that into the clinical care of how we take care of our patients. The other piece is to use what we know around food, because we know, as you said, food is fundamental. And so how do we train the clinicians to actually utilize food as a pathway that folks who, if you have access and we're giving access to the patients to certain types of food, can begin in terms of managing some of the downstream consequences on their health. And if we are situated, as we are, in federally qualified health centers, which in our community, in Alameda County, we're serving 89% Black, Indigenous, people of color patients, right? Most of our patients are that. Then you have a platform to do the work of undoing some of these elements, or at least mitigating some of the root causes around racism and structural inequities. Just because we're playing in that sandbox, and if we don't even if we're playing in that sandbox and not using food to address some of these things, then we're missing the boat, right? And then I think there's this kind of system level approach. If healthcare, this $3.9 billion industry, is standing up and able to use the power in our capitalist system of dollars, right, to create demand for a particular type of food, and we then center and create opportunities for people of color who are doing the farming, right? We have a whole historic injustice around Black farmers in this country. And if we're able to create and address that by creating the downstream demand for the upstream supply needs, you create more opportunities. But in those opportunities, the risk is you get the big Walmarts or the big existing structures with more resources to get in there and then take the opportunities. So then creating guardrails to say, how do we have an equity focus when we do policy work that's going to create this new flow of opportunity.
I love that. I like that idea of specifically targeting farmers of color as the source for the kinds of program that you've built.
Right. So if we are sourcing the food, not only regeneratively, how do we add the lens of health and racial equity? It's really the connection that needs to happen is to get beyond the siloed thinking of medicine just stays in its lane and farming stays in its lane. We have to be able to think systems wide and actually develop the metrics and the political will to make that happen. And then I would just say, at the basic level of food, when I was at Asian Health Services in Oakland, Chinatown, once I opened and talked about food, my patients opened up in ways to me that I would have totally missed if I was never open to it. Just like acupuncture. If I'm open to acupuncture, my patients start talking about these integrative approaches. Well, if I totally neglect that and invisibilize that, these approaches that are near and dear to my patients, am I not a part of kind of reproducing the invisibilization of these practices, which is in itself potentially racist, right? Based on where you are situated, right? If I am, or sexist or whatnot. And so it's the visibility piece and the one-on-one piece that has to happen. So you have structural, interpersonal, all of these things. And since, as you said, food is foundational, we can work on so many fronts together. Some clinicians just want to do the one-on-one. So be it. Get trained up, have the sensitivity around food, use it powerfully, understand your patients and what their preferences are, validate that. Some want to work at the systems level. We do that with, creating equity guardrails, sourcing the food from farmers of color, et cetera. There's so many ways to tackle it.
Yeah, I like this very much. The whole idea of the intersectionality and the systems thinking is so important. It kind of gets us towards the end of the conversation, because I was going to ask you, and you've touched on it, but I think we can tie it a little closer. What is it going to take to make food as medicine the norm? And that really ties a lot to policy and data collection and making the case. And so do you see that happening? What's the time frame in your mind, and what are the steps that are going to get us to the idea that food as medicine becomes a norm and is basically practiced everywhere? It's ubiquitous.
Right. What's the roadmap, right?
Yeah.
And how do we operationalize it? Wow, that is a question that is huge, and I'm just one of many voices. So I'm happy to just kind of opine.
Okay.
I do think that one piece is bringing the multiple voices across the multiple systems, not only together for a conference, and I know President Biden's going to do that with this larger arc of hunger, nutrition, and health, right? Kind of connecting the dots. But we have to have, beyond a gathering, we have to have an ability to roadmap that out and operationalize that, right? And so at the high level, you got to get folks from multiple sectors together in the same house, and you got to have an equity lens, right? It can't be just the same players, to have the multiplicity of voices, and then the allocation of resources to actually carry this out, to develop the roadmap and to carry it out. Elements of that roadmap, or elements of those things that need to be carried out, I'll just call out a few. I'm not going to sequence it a particular way, but certainly within healthcare, right, within the biomedicine healthcare, an investment in reorienting some of the education that has to happen with our clinicians in training.
So that's med school. You're talking about med school.
Med school, nurse practitioner school, PA school, nursing school, nutritionist, RD school, whatever elements. And we have other domains that are other integrative practices that are already doing that, right? But how do we knit it all together? Chinese medicine has always had a food as medicine approach. Doctors of osteopathy, maybe, depending on where they are. Acupuncture, all of these things, right? So there's an educational piece that has to happen. That takes years. That's like paradigm shifting work, right? That's like Dr. Paul Berg saying, hey, this is happening 30 years, but you got to start somewhere. I would say connecting that also to the research element on food as medicine and continuing to develop a whole field, if you will, or just to kind of bring all of that there. But also not to only put it all on the research as the only source of truth.
Mm.
Indigenous communities of color have known this. So there's other epistemological ways of knowing, and that should be validated and accepted as well.
That's
right.
Good.
So that's a piece. I think another piece is you need to have political leadership, right? We had that here in Alameda County, and I'm going to cite Supervisor Wilma Chan. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, she passed away, but she had the large enough vision to say this needs to happen here in this county, and take it, Stephen, take it to the state and take it to the nation, right? At least what we're trying to do. she has connected us to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, to pitch the idea with Barbara Lee and others, political leadership, food as medicine type pilots across the nation. Imagine our Surgeon General, our Secretary of Health and Human Services saying, we are going to, just as we did with COVID, we are going to invest in this type of food as medicine apiece because it's fundamental, as you said, in not only health systems, but in the health system too. So having champions and their allocation of resources to be able to make these happen is going to be a critical piece. There's a lot of different pieces, but there's a lot of smarter people than me. We would have to get in there. Everyone has to get in the room and start thinking together on how to roadmap.
I think you hit some very primary core elements of what needs to happen, and I think that I mean, in my opinion, it seems that there is a lot of momentum in this area, and California is one of the leaders, obviously. So it seems like there is some opportunity. As you mentioned, the president's going to do his big summit in the fall, and our former Attorney General is now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we have a really good example of what you're doing, and there's some others in the state that are doing things, and then we have our allies, mutual allies at Wholesome Wave doing things in other parts of the country. It just does seem like the right mixture, the right recipe exists for getting this off the ground.
I think you're right. I mean, I think this is a very exciting moment in time. And as one of my Buddhist friends has said in Taiwan, when I was doing some work out there in a hospice, any single moment requires thousands of synchronistic things to happen. The fact that you and I are having this conversation. And there's a momentum for things to happen. And there's a momentum, and then there's also barriers. We know that when this takes on energy, there are going to be other forces that come in, right, to take their opportunities. And so having guardrails and an awareness of that, and that's where I say, how do we involve the private to support the public, private-public partnerships with the public sentiment or the public boundaries around equity and centering that, and then recognizing privates and social impact have their directives, but how do we harness that when necessary or when helpful with the appropriate guardrails?
Right. I agree. And that's where the citizenry of our country becomes important. The democracy piece. It's like Wilma Chan was elected by a community. Wilma Chan had a certain kind of consciousness that led her to link with you and to open this opportunity. I mean, that's important that those kinds of people get elected, and that really depends on all Americans in certain ways. So it's an exciting time, and we've run out of time. So Dr. Chen, I really want to thank you for I know you're a busy man. You got a lot that you're responsible for, including taking care of individual families and individual patients, but also an entire system in Alameda County and running this very important, innovative program. So thank you for your time and your insights, your experience, and for sharing what you know.
Michael, thank you so much for this opportunity. I want to just say that there's so many people to thank. We've had such great leadership here in Alameda County with supervisor at the supervisorial level, Supervisor Chan, Supervisor Brown, all the supervisors at the agency level with our agency directors like Colleen Chawla, my own direct boss, and All In, Lisa says White. I mean, there's so many people. And then there's all the folks that actually make it work, all my colleagues on the team. This doesn't happen. It's not a single person show. This is like thousands of multiple synchronistic events happening to make it happen.
Great. Okay. Thank you, sir. Take care.
Thanks so much.
We'll be back in touch. All right.
Happy to talk. Bye.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our sponsors, the Ladybug Foundation, Dan and Quincy Imhoff, Beth and Mark Wyatt, Cindy Daniel, and Doug Lipton. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.